Welcome back to the Act Two podcast, a podcast for the real life working screenwriter. I am Josh Hallman.
And I am Dave Levinson.
Dave is back, baby. Tasha's kicked off the podcast. She's out. How's it feel?
She had a good run. I think she had a good run, but you know, it was time for some fresh voices.
Yeah, no, she's not out. She's still in Tokyo.
Thank God. Thank God. You guys are still in good hands.
But she's still in Tokyo. She actually just got back when this comes out. I think she just got back yesterday. And I didn't tell you this, Dave, but I was talking to Tasha and I was like, hey, we're going to be one podcast behind, or we were texting. I guess we kind of made a mistake. And she said, well, how about I come back and we'll record that day and then we'll get it edited and then posted. And I was like, you're going to be coming back from Tokyo or Japan. There's no chance this is happening. And she was crazy enough to give it a shot. And then I talked to you.
That could have turned into a phenomenal episode, depending on how delirious she was. And, you know, it's like almost akin to like taking some mushrooms and then recording. Who knows? Who knows what kind of energy Tasha would have brought. But
delirious Tasha.
You chose to play it safe, which I respect.
Listen, I don't know if we're playing it safe right now because we have a topic that's going to get us heated. And right now, Dave is wearing a shirt that says he's back. Halloween 4.
That's right. This is my Halloween 4 t-shirt, but the graphic looks like an old school Goosebumps book cover. And do you know where I got this shirt, Josh? I got the shirt at the Halloween, I think it was the 40-year convention in Pasadena last year. Or 45-year. Yeah, 45-year anniversary convention in Pasadena. Which was kind of a wild scene. That was the first time I had gone to a convention like that.
Yeah.
But they had some really cool merch. And I walked away with some cool stuff.
What did you do at the convention?
So it was sort of split into two. There was a big room that had a lot of really cool art. You know, it was basically just booths selling merch. And so there was a lot of really cool art, really cool t-shirts. And then also sort of the stereotypical convention thing where like they had tables where actors from various Halloween films were there for meet and greets with the fans. There were some deep cuts as far as the actors that were there. Like nurse number 3 from Halloween 5 was there. You know, it was that sort of thing. And then in another room at the convention center, they had just panels going all day. And so I sat in on a panel that was about the original Halloween movie. And it was with a bunch of the actors from the original, which that was really cool to hear them all kind of reminisce and talk about what the original means and all that. It was, I was really glad that I went and just saw what there was to see.
So, funny enough, and we will not go down a rabbit hole of conventions, but I went to a Back to the Future. I don't even know if it wasn't really a convention. It was like a thing at the house in Pasadena, and it was where Doc Brown's house is, and they had a ton of DeLoreans. They had it was insane. It was like the entire block.
That sounds awesome.
It was, but the big like guy who was there was Mayor Goldie Wilson. He had his own booth. I think he was off to the side. And I was just like, oh yeah, it's the actor that plays Mayor Goldie Wilson. And I was just like, these conventions are crazy, man.
It is crazy how you can like play this, you know, I'm sure in the moment as you're filming this movie, it's like a small supporting role. Mm-hmm. And then the movie becomes legendary and that character lives forever. And you can show up at conventions 45 years later to represent the character that, you know, had 5 minutes of screen time and a classic.
I think about that, and like we'll probably touch on this, but even in just tying this together is like even in some of the sequels and things that we're going to talk about today, I always think about how crazy it is where actors get pulled back when they've been not working or they've been their path of their careers on a completely different trajectory, and then they all of a sudden do the same movie that made them like go on the map. And it always kind of blows my mind. It's crazy.
Yeah, the craziest part of the panel that I sat in on with the some of the cast members from the original Halloween was I am blanking on her name, but they had the actress that played Michael Myers' sister that gets killed in the opening of the original Halloween.
How could you
Basically,
blank on her name? How dare you?
ba- basically you see her with her boyfriend. They disappear upstairs to have sex. The boyfriend leaves. Michael goes upstairs and you see her topless brushing her hair, and then he just stabs her to death, and that's it.
Yeah.
And she talked about that, she did that movie and I think a couple of other small like schlocky horror movies, and then just kind of fell out of acting, and now she like lives in Texas and has a completely different career, and she hadn't thought about these movies in like decades,
Wow.
and she just got a phone call out of the blue from an agent who represents actors to send them to these conventions. And he was basically, "Hi, is this like so and so, who played Michael Myers' sister in Halloween?"
Yeah.
And he was basically just like, you can make some money from this." And she that I want to say this was her first convention, the one that I went to last year. But
Dude.
just talk about being like plucked out of, back out of your normal life and just thrust back into the world of Michael Myers.
In 20 years from now, I want to get a phone call. And they were like, is this Josh from the Act Two podcast?
Yeah.
All right. Today we are talking about sequels, horror movie sequels, and like the best sequels, what makes a good sequel. We're going to dive into all of this. I think you and I got pretty excited when this topic came up.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm pumped for this episode.
but before that, Dave, are you ready for This Week in Writing?
Always.
This Week in Writing.
My daughter, she one day was walking through the house. It was dark, and I was like in the kitchen, and she was kind of in the corner, and she scared me because I didn't know she was in the corner. And I was like, oh my God, this was a long time ago. And she started to laugh really hard. And I was like, that's not cool. Amelia, you can't scare me like that. And she was like, hey, ran away. So she somehow learned in that moment how to scare me in a proper way. So for the last like 2 months of my life, when it gets dark, my daughter will go into like random corners, or she'll stand in hallways, and it scares the shit out of me over and over and over again. And I know this isn't a This Week in Writing, but I'm just bringing this up because I just needed to say it. It felt appropriate.
I cannot explain to you how proud I am of Amelia. Shout out to Amelia. Can you imagine what if this is like the start of like a long career for Amelia in the horror genre, and she just becomes like the next generation's master of horror?
Just the subtle scares. She
Yeah,
becomes M Night,
queen of the
um,
slow burn.
queen of the slow burn. Okay, I just had to get that off my chest. I knew you'd appreciate it.
Yeah, this is therapy.
It's therapy. All right. So I've talked about this before on the podcast. You know what this script very well that I'm going to talk about. It's called The Witch of Greengrove. And I started to think about it. I always kind of,
Great script.
and so I've talked about this, and it came back into my mind after we did the last episode about the rules and mystery. And, we're in the season. So I was kind of thinking about horror films, even though this isn't really a horror film, which might have been a problem from the get-go, which we could talk about. But I was thinking about this script. You read it. It went through a million revisions. I kind of came into it on one angle, and then I it wasn't really me. And eventually I tried to shoehorn it to become me and more in my tone of what I wanted to write.
Hmm.
Um, and the idea of it is basically it's this girl, it's like, I guess Disturbia meets Don't Breathe. That was how I always kind of viewed it, where this girl goes into a house on Halloween and it turns out to be haunted, and it's this witch's house. She gets stuck and then she can't get out. And I was kind of thinking about the script and what's wrong with it, because there are problems with it, a lot of problems. But I think I never really quite figured out the rules of this haunted house.
That was
And
that was to harken back to last week's episode, that was a big rules script for sure. You
Totally.
you had your hands full with that.
I had my hands full, and I was a little overwhelmed, and I don't think I definitely didn't deliver. I didn't, and just talking about it's kind of making me a little depressed. But it was just a
No,
reminder of
that
how.
the don't listen to Josh, everybody out there. It was a very, very fun script.
Do you know that script
It,
started as the idea was? It was like when a girl comes back home from college, she gets confronted by home invaders, but then finds out she has magical abilities. Like that was like the original idea where it's like this girl who's learning she has like magic takes on home invaders, and somehow it evolved into she breaks into a witch's house next door, which is crazy to think about the evolution of.
it was such an amazing setup though, because it was. I mean, that's the perfect pitch. Disturbia meets Don't Breathe, because right, it was this girl comes home from college, becomes suspicious of this new neighbor who has some creepy, suspicious vibes about her, and then breaks into the house, and the house winds up being much more than it seems, both sort of, both symbolically and also physically.
Yeah,
The house changes, and yeah, it was. I mean, it was crazy and wild and fun, and just but a lot of rules that you had to come up with. I wasn't envious of you having to figure all that out
it
and
sucked.
juggle it all for a
Well,
whole entire script.
I appreciate it. I let you go just so I could feel better about myself. But yeah, no,
Like I said,
I
this is therapy.
it is therapy. I just still bummed about that script. Anyway, I just wanted to bring it up on the importance of having rules and really locking them in. And if you're definitely going to play around in a haunted house, you have to lock in why things happen, the cause and effect, and everything. You just have to. There's no getting around it. I tried it. I failed. That's it. That's the end of my This Week in Writing.
You know what it's kind of like, which I wish that I'd thought of this analogy last week, but it's kind of like ground rules in a sport, right? Like when you're playing
Yeah.
when you're playing in a certain park for baseball, because every baseball park stadium is different, the dimensions are different, and there are ground rules. Like if the ball, in Fenway Park, for instance, in left center field, there's the green monster, and then in center field, that wall gets much shorter than what the green monster is in left field, and there is a yellow vertical line, and if the ball lands on one side of that yellow line, it is off the wall. If the ball lands on the other side of that yellow line, it is gone and it's a home run. And so
That's crazy.
it's like in every different individual MLB park, there are ground rules that are slightly different that define how the game is going to be played. And it's like that for haunted house movies. I feel like you got to come up with the ground rules.
There's never been anything more perfect than what you
that
just
was an insane ramble.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
I thought of the idea and I thought it was brilliant in the moment, and then I just went. So apologies.
No way. That's what the Act Two podcast is for. Do you have a This Week in Writing? Is there anything you want to discuss?
Sure. I had a notes meeting last week, at the end of last week, that went really well. But I think sort of what I took away from it is just a reminder of how important it is once you finish a draft of a thing to kind of give it a little bit of time and space, and step away from it for a little bit to kind of clear your mind in regards to that project and come back fresh. Because I'm developing this thriller with a producer who's also a very good friend of mine, and I had sent him this treatment for it, and then we had our notes call last week, which was like, I think about a month and a half, 2 months after I had sent him the treatment. He has a baby, which is,
Sure. Excuses.
Yeah. And but so I hadn't even looked at this thing in like a couple of months, and I realized my approaching the notes meeting was really refreshing, because I was just open to anything that he was going to say, basically. And also I felt like I had more outside of the box solutions come to me far quicker than they would have if we had the notes meeting like a week later, and everything that I had just written was still super fresh in my head. So yeah, I feel like just it was a great reminder for me that, taking a little time and space away from a project really sort of it helps to open yourself up to different ideas that can strengthen your movie or your TV show.
That is always the case. It feels like taking a
Hmm.
step back is the way to go, but it's so
And you,
much.
you you just become less precious.
Yeah, it's so much easier said than done. It's
Hmm.
unbelievable how
Oh yeah, so that's why, like,
it's
that's
impossible.
why it was a good reminder, is because I never do it, because I like I always feel this like pressure that I put on myself of, we have to keep the momentum going. We got to keep
Uh-huh.
pushing forward and get this thing done. And so I never finish something and then take a month or 2 months away from it. But in this case, it was really, I think it was really helpful. And now I'm kind of diving in on these notes, and it feels like good. I feel good, and I feel energized about the idea rather than sort of beaten down.
You're in a good
Um,
place.
yeah, it's important.
Okay, Dave,
Josh,
our big topic. The best horror sequels, according to you and I,
the definitive list
the definitive
brought to you by
list.
Josh and Dave.
Um, no,
So
so
let me
Dave,
like,
yeah, go,
well,
go,
I'm
go.
just going to preface for mine that these are obviously personal opinions and personal favorites. This isn't supposed to be.
No,
I don't think this is supposed to be, a definitive list where we're necessarily trying to name like the greatest sequels of all time. But these are, at least for me, these are my personal favorite horror sequels of all time.
no, absolutely. This is in no way, shape, or form anything that we're like saying this is definitively the best, because movies mean different things for everybody.
But also, if any listeners out there feel like we missed something, that there was just a glaring oversight, I feel like they should probably reach out to you and let you know.
No, totally. Absolutely. Yeah, reach out if we missed anything. Let's discuss what makes a good horror sequel.
Yeah, which I feel like we almost kind of nailed down just after making our list.
Mm-hmm.
There was sort of a common through line, I think, in our list.
Yeah. So this is what I wrote down. It pushes the mythology forward from the original. It creates a franchise, even
Hmm.
more so. It moves the franchise forward. It pays homage to the characters. A sequel is true to the DNA of the original film and moves things forward. That's essentially what I wrote down. Did
Yeah,
I miss
no, I
anything?
think I think other the only other element that I can think of is if it just like wildly improves on the original.
Right. And it's hard to do, by the way, not just horror sequels, but any sequels in general. It's really difficult to push something forward where you see an original, you're like, I love this, we're getting a sequel. But with horror films, I think are so difficult because sometimes they have such specific scares and there's specific things. Like it's hard to push um, Jason Voorhees forward, because it's just a dude in a slashing people around a lake. I mean, like, how do you keep moving that
Yeah,
forward?
you have to
But
start coming up with some like crazy ass mythology.
totally.
But and let me say that I think that it's extremely rare that a sequel wildly improves on its original. That's not something. I don't think that's something that happens often, but
I have one in my
occasionally,
list.
occasionally it does. I have one in my list as well.
Okay. So we're going to give a list of our top horror sequels. But before,
And these are in no particular order, correct?
correct, no particular order. It's just what we feel in the moment. But before we do that, I have a little surprise for you. And
You have a surprise for me?
I have a surprise for you and for the Act Two podcast. Are you ready for it?
I don't know.
Okay. Here we
I'm
go.
as ready as I'll ever be.
So I am in Tokyo, but Josh asked me to send my favorite horror movie sequels. So here I go. Well, first of all, I don't remember a lot of them, which I think tells you a lot. But my first would be the Paranormal series. I think every single one of those were stellar, and they could have easily sucked, and they did not. They just kept surprising you because they always had a new device, I think, to scare the shit out of you. And then my other one would be Prey. It's not a direct sequel in the Predator series. It's not a number 2, but it is an incredible follow-up to a series that many thought was dead. So Prey as a Predator sequel would be another horror movie sequel that I love. So that's me from Tokyo. Bye!
Wow.
Tasha from Tokyo.
That was magical. That was a great surprise.
Yeah.
She also took one of ours.
She did take one of ours. We were messaging about an hour before we came on, and I don't know what time it is there, but I was like,
so she just sent that?
She just sent that.
What a trooper. That's dedication.
So going off of, what Tasha said about paranormal, my first on my list, our list, Paranormal 2. Is it just called Paranormal 2?
Paranormal Activity 2.
Paranormal Activity 2, of course. All right, so Paranormal Activity 2. My thoughts about this. This is why this movie's so awesome. Number 1, there's a baby in it. There's nothing scarier than when a baby's involved in one of these kind of movies.
Let me tell you, since I had my daughter not 19 months ago,
it's not funny.
One of the biggest changes that I have undergone is that any movie where a young child is in danger or in extreme distress creates the most visceral reaction in my gut and my chest that did not exist before I had my daughter. So that's that. If you are a filmmaker and you are looking for a way to make something scary, well, I mean, what a cheat code.
That is it. Just bring in. I mean, it's not even funny but it's so scary. And like when the baby's at the edge of a crib, and there's a demon in the house, all these things. But another thing, a couple of my thoughts here, is that this movie, which I didn't really realize it until kind of revisiting it, it serves not only as a sequel, but it's a prequel, which is really freaking interesting. And
it spans both.
It spans both, though. So it expands the world building. It offers new backstory. It kind of brings up more of this curse within the family. And I feel like this is a perfect example of doing what the original did, but just elevating the shit out of it and making it a lot cooler in a different house with new cameras and just different kinds of scares. So Paranormal 2.
Yeah, I will that's actually one of my most memorable theater going experiences. I saw Paranormal Activity 2 opening weekend at the Grove, and it was just like a raucous crowd, and the movie was just terrifying. I feel like the last 15 to 20 minutes of that movie was so scary that it was like nearly unbearable in the theater. It was just so intense. And like you said, they just like took everything that the original did, which was brilliant, and just elevated it. They elevated the scares, and they also, I mean, they essentially create the mythology that becomes the Paranormal Activity franchise. Because I don't think, maybe I'm misremembering, but I don't think that there was very deep mythology involved in the original. I believe, I haven't watched it in a few years, but I believe that it's just very simply this couple being haunted, setting up cameras, and the haunting unfolds. And then the second one sort of starts off building that mythology, but it doesn't, it doesn't push it to crazy lengths where it goes off the rails, as you could maybe argue it does a little bit later in the series. But yeah, the second one is kind of perfect.
You're right. That's brilliant. It offers more information about the mythology, but it doesn't go into too much depth about the mythology. So then it just keeps opening up further and further as the franchise goes on.
Yeah, it was like the perfect kickoff for the rest of the franchise.
So that's my first.
Right. For my first, I will go with A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Dream Warriors. which came out way back in 1987. Um, and yeah, this is the third Nightmare on Elm Street. Notably, Wes Craven came back to the franchise as a screenwriter here, so he wrote the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, in this Nightmare, Nancy, the final girl from the original, she's now working at a psychiatric hospital, and she winds up helping this group of kids who are being haunted by Freddy Krueger in their dreams. And there's this one girl who has sort of a special power where she can pull other people into her dreams. And so this group of kids, with the help of Nancy, they sort of team up together to take down Freddy in sort of like a teamwork kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And this was just, I think it was a really kind of fun ensemble piece in a really interesting setting because it takes place mostly in this psychiatric hospital.
Yeah.
And, whereas I feel like certainly the first two Nightmares and then most slasher movies at this point, I think, just kind of take place, in the suburbs. And so taking the movie and setting it in a psychiatric hospital was I think pretty original at the time. And then it deepens Freddy Krueger's backstory in an interesting way. You kind of hear this really kind of grisly, gnarly story about a nurse who who accidentally gets locked in this mental hospital with like all these violent criminal mental patients, and that is basically how Freddy Krueger was born. And then, yeah, it's also just, it introduces a really cool and creative element that's
Mm.
almost akin to a superpower, where this girl is able to pull other people into her dreams and they can team up to take Freddy down. And I think that it just sort of really kind of re-energized the franchise at the time.
So this movie, I think, has one of the scariest things that happened to me as a child. It has that moment where I believe it's three, is where Freddy makes that one person, puts blood out of their veins, and they're moving like a puppet, and then commits suicide, right?
Yeah, yep.
And
It's like a puppet marionette situation,
yes.
but using like veins, basically.
Yeah, and I remember seeing that when I was way too young, and just thinking about how painful and scary that is, and it just is always stuck with me. So I feel like you might like Freddy 3 maybe a bit more than I do, but you just sold me on it, and I love it now.
You should revisit it.
I'm going to.
Among slasher sequels, I feel like it's definitely up there in the pantheon.
Oh wow. Okay. I guess I'm just going to jump into my next one. I have nothing more to add to that. The Conjuring Part 2.
Hell yeah.
The freaking Conjuring Part 2.
Also one of the scariest theater experiences of my life at the Vista.
I got to tell you, if I didn't respect The Conjuring as much as I do, I might like The Conjuring 2 more than I like The Conjuring.
Well, let me tell you, I feel like I always talk about this, but I consider The Conjuring and The Conjuring Part 2 to essentially be The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 of haunted house movies. Meaning that the original Conjuring is one of the greatest horror movies, one of the greatest haunted house movies of all time. But The Conjuring Part 2 is at least as good in my mind, and arguably better than the original.
Absolutely don't disagree. The Conjuring 2, I saw that in the theater. It terrified me. I remember just like, I almost had my eyes closed watching it. And I think what's great about it is it really focuses on character. I know how crazy that sounds, but like the Ed and Lorraine, they focus on those characters. I feel like this movie built it out. And what this movie did to scare me to no end was it introduced that freaking nun. Which now has her own movie, like multiple own movies. When did
Valak,
Annabelle?
I think, right? Is the demon's name?
That's the nun. That scared the shit out of me. Wait, what is did Annabelle get introduced in the first one?
Yeah, the first one opens with the story of Annabelle.
Okay.
And then Annabelle is sort of a thread throughout the first one, because then there's like the
Oh, that's right.
scene, the daughter becomes kind of fascinated by Annabelle in the Warrens occult museum. So Annabelle's service is sort of a thread throughout the first one. And then same thing with the nun in the second one. So the nun sort of steps in for Annabelle. But the nun
Yeah.
is just so fucking scary.
So scary. But yeah, I feel like what The Conjuring does so well is it in The Conjuring 2 is it just sticks to kind of similar themes about like faith and redemption and things. It's always very grounded in character. So you're
Hmm.
always rooting for the characters, and you really, um, you don't want them to die. Oh, and they played that game, the clap game.
That's from the first one.
Okay, I'm making that up, but
Do they play it? I don't think. Do they play it again in the second one?
it's now these are blending together because you said they were just
But
two best
the
movies.
second one also has some really fun devices that are like the clap game that are, I think, just as effective. Like there's in the second one, there's the Crooked Man game that the
Mm-hmm.
kid has,
Mm-hmm.
which, to be honest, I think like that there's that scene where the Crooked Man attacks the house and he's just the giant Crooked Man. And I kind of think that scene is a little bit goofy,
Sure.
but the game itself, like it's like this spinning thing that creates like shadows on the wall and like a little light show. That thing is creepy as all hell.
That's
Throughout
right.
the first half of the movie.
So brilliant. And I think what Conjuring 2 does so well is they just try to get out of the house time and time again, and they just never
Mhm.
can. Like they don't
Yeah.
want to be there, which I think is always the number one thing in horror movies where you're like, are you doing everything you can to get away from a demon or the threat or the slasher? And if the answer is yes, I'm in.
That always scores a lot of points with me. If the characters are taking every step that you would take to escape,
Yeah.
the demon or whatever the horrifying situation is.
Okay. That was mine. Go.
All right, my next choice is, and remember this is in no particular order,
Yeah.
but my next choice is Halloween H2O,
Yeah.
which came out in 1998 and was the seventh installment in the Halloween franchise.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess so. First of all, this movie essentially it wipes out Halloween 3 through 6, and it's essentially a direct sequel to Halloween 2.
Was that the first time that had happened? Like in general,
That's a good question. I actually don't know. That's a really good question.
because Jurassic Park, not saying it's a horror film, but like Jurassic World is a direct sequel to Jurassic Park, and it wipes out Jurassic Park 2 and Jurassic Park 3. But now there's 3 Jurassic Worlds.
Yeah, we're getting to this point now where there's just like 4 or 5 different timelines within franchises that
Yeah.
can get a little bit confusing unless you're a diehard fan.
Yeah.
But
yes,
yeah,
H2O,
I guess
you just
it gives you creative freedom, I guess.
but it also makes you not care when you're watching. You're like, okay, this could be wiped out. But yeah, H2O, it made the leap.
Yeah, so H2O makes the leap, and it's 20 years after the events of Halloween 1 and 2. And Jamie Lee Curtis's character, Laurie Strode, she has faked her death, and she's gone into hiding working as the headmistress of a boarding school in California, where her son, which was actually Josh Hartnett's first role, I believe.
Oh,
Her
I thought it
son
was I thought it was the faculty.
So I rewatched Halloween H2O last week, and in the opening credits it says "and introducing Josh Hartnett,"
Interesting.
and then I looked up, and they came out in the same year. They both came out in 1998.
Hartnett.
So maybe I didn't look up the exact release dates. Maybe H2O came out before the faculty. I'm not sure, but. And then, yeah, so she's, the headmistress at this boarding school where her son is a student. And on the 20-year anniversary of Michael Myers' initial massacre, he tracks Laurie down and he tries to finish the job. And it's kind of a really simple setup, but this movie just does so many things so well. First of all, I think it kind of modernizes the franchise a little bit while simultaneously paying homage to the original and one of horror's greatest final girls in Laurie Strode. I think in kind of the late 80s and early 90s, I think some of the Halloween sequels, the franchise had kind of become a little bit schlocky and weighed down with some fairly ridiculous mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And this movie just like brings it back to the basics while also ushering it into the late 90s era that was a little bit more defined by Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer.
Sure.
And I mean, you just get that from the presence of Josh Hartnett and Michelle Williams, who was coming off of Dawson's Creek. And
Yeah.
so the tone of it feels much more of the time with Scream and I Know We Did Last Summer, and kind of the comeback of the slasher genre.
Yeah.
And then the movie also just like, in rewatching it recently, I had kind of forgotten actually how incredible of a slow burn this movie is. It
Mm-hmm.
shows amazing restraint and just like lets the suspense and the character development carry the weight of a huge portion of the movie, because there's a really tense, kind of impressively tense, scary cold open. But then after the cold open, there's not another kill until after the midpoint, which I think is pretty amazing for a part 7 in a slasher franchise. um,
Yeah, that's good. You brought that up, and I actually recently watched the movie just because it was on. I don't even remember why. I was like, oh yeah, H2O, I'll check it out, and it's really good. It definitely holds
yeah,
up.
it kind of like, so I feel like I see various scenes from it a lot because it's on TV a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But when I rewatched it last week, it was the first time that I had watched it beginning to end in one sitting in a little while. And it struck me that it kind of accomplishes what the first movie in the David Gordon Green trilogy, the most recent trilogy of Halloween movies,
Mm-hmm.
what that movie tried to do, I feel like H2O accomplishes and is actually better. That's my personal opinion, but it
So the David Gordon Green movies, are those connected to H2O?
no. So the David Gordon Green movies actually, that's a direct sequel to the original Halloween, and that does away with Halloween 2 as well as all the other sequels.
Oh my God.
Which basically what that does is the mythology that Laurie is Michael's sister, that comes about in Halloween 2. And so David Gordon Green's trilogy comes from the perspective that Laurie is not Michael's sister, and it
Oh,
does
really?
away with that backstory, and she's just a random victim of this Halloween night massacre, which is interesting. I like those movies also. I think that it's an interesting take and has some themes that were worth exploring about trauma and sort of the randomness of violence. But H2O, I think for me, it just feels a little bit more a part
Yeah.
of the Halloween franchise, and still gives Laurie her kind of victory lap.
I don't. I don't like it. I think she's Michael Myers' sister. So, okay.
Josh has spoken.
Moving on. Happy Death Day to You.
Love this movie.
I love this movie too. So, Happy Death Day, if anyone hasn't seen it, which you definitely should see it, is basically it's like a slasher comedy, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay. And it's Groundhog's Day with the slasher. The girl just keeps reliving this slasher. So, Happy Death Day to You it's basically like a Back to the Future. It has elements of like this time travel like thing that's happening, and there's like a time loop, and there's a
And
conductor.
like multiple dimensions, I think, right? It's like,
Yeah, it gets wild. I don't know how, but it's such a fun movie. Like, I don't know how it does this, that you're kind of forgetting about all of the science and things that are kind of going over your head. And there's this person who's like, they're we're in a loop where this is happening, and it explains, going back to like the mythology connectivity, is it explains why the loop is happening, but it is so complex, but you forget about all of it because the slasher element is so much fun, in my opinion. And there's still like little jump scares, and I just love watching this movie.
Yeah, and I think that the complexity of the time travel and the, different dimensions and realities, it I think it adds to the fun. Like, this movie basically takes all the fun from the original and spins it in like a really creative new direction with these like slightly more sci-fi elements.
Hmm.
But I think that it just elevates what the original did and makes it just even more fun and wacky. And but it also, I remember, I like I got pretty emotional at certain points of this movie because it poses kind of some pretty emotional questions about like dealing with grief, and because basically in the various realities different things have happened and different things have not happened in each
Yeah.
reality. And so our main girl finds herself in a reality where her mom, who has died in, you know, has died. That's part of her backstory. She finds
Hmm.
herself in a reality where her mom is still alive.
Yeah.
And then it sort of asks this question of like, do you try to get back to your reality, or do you just stay here where your mom is alive? And what are the consequences of that? And so, yeah, I just think it's a really, really fun movie. I saw this at I feel like I keep bringing up theater experiences, but I guess that's
Yeah.
just
Go.
a really defining, thing for movies in my mind. I saw this at a really fun double feature with the original Happy Death Day. So it was Happy Death Day, immediately followed by Happy Death Day to You at the
Oh,
Egyptian. And it was just a blast. Like
really?
one of the most fun experiences I've had.
That sounds like it would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and there
And
was
then
a
it
Q
probably,
and a with the director, Chris Landon, and I think
right.
the actress. And I also just realized that Chris Landon actually has two entries on our list because he wrote Paranormal Activity too.
Wow. Landon coming in
Yeah,
hot.
coming in
And,
hot. Okay, my next entry is Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which is
mm,
also part of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, making, I believe, the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise the only franchise with two entries on
hmm.
our list. But this movie came out in 1994. It was the seventh installment in the Nightmare franchise, and this movie is just so cool and creative. It's so meta. This movie stars Heather Langenkamp, who plays Nancy in the original Nightmare movie, but in this she's playing herself. And Wes Craven, the writer and director, he also appears in the movie as himself. Robert Englund, who plays Freddy
Hmm.
Krueger, also appears in the movie as himself.
Right.
And basically, the concept is just that, Heather gets asked to star in a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie, and then she starts having nightmares about Freddy Krueger. And he soon, proves to be far more real than just a fictional movie character. And he starts targeting Heather and her young son and terrorizing them.
Hmm.
And this movie terrified me as a kid. Like, I remember seeing this on HBO or Showtime or something when I was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old. And I feel like growing up, this is probably the Nightmare on Elm Street movie that I was most familiar with. I
Interesting.
think that, yeah, because I may have seen this before I saw the original, even because it was like I just stumbled upon it on TV as a kid.
Yeah.
So this, don't quote me on this, but this may have been my introduction to Freddy Krueger, which I guess could
Wow.
explain why
That's crazy.
I guess it could explain why I hold it in such high esteem. But I really do think that it's just a great movie. It's darker and scarier than most of the other sequels, because throughout the franchise, as there were more and more movies made, Freddy almost becomes a comedic character, sort of a caricature of what Wes
Sure.
Craven had, initially meant to do with the character. And this kind of
Hmm.
brings Freddy back to that original vision of Freddy as this dark, menacing murderer. The other really cool thing I think
Oh,
about this movie is that it was essentially Wes Craven's precursor to Scream in how meta it
yeah.
is. This movie came out 2 years before Scream, and you watch this, and it's almost like Wes is just like testing out those muscles in order to then go make the Scream franchise, which I just think is awesome.
I kind of forgotten about this movie. It wasn't until you brought it up. I was like, oh, that's right. And I do remember seeing it when I was younger and just being really confused. I think this might have been my first meta, like bad guy experience where I was like, wait, what is going on? Like Freddy Krueger is playing, like Robert Englund is playing himself, and one Freddy looked different than the other. Like there was just so many weird things happening at one time. But I remember this movie freaking me out, and I agree with everything you said. And I want to just go into my next one because, not to step on your toes unless you have more to say,
No.
because I feel like
Take
it
the
is
baton.
perfect. Okay, because my next one was going to be, or is going to be, Scream 2.
Wes Craven.
Wes
Also coming in hot.
coming
This is
in
Wes's
real hot.
third entry on our list.
This is crazy. But it is wild. I'll get back to Scream 2, but the meta-ness of Freddy to where we entered with Scream, it's crazy, dude. It's just weird.
Yeah, it seems like it was clearly something that he was interested in exploring. Thankfully for us, because we got some amazing movies.
So Scream 2. You want to hear one of my fondest memories of Scream 2?
Absolutely.
This was the first movie that I actively tried to find the script for on the internet when I was younger.
Really?
Yes. Like, I remember not really knowing what scripts were, not really knowing how Hollywood worked, but just being on the internet and like typing in like Scream 2 screenplay or whatever it was. And there were different versions that were coming back because I had read an article that the script had been like leaked online or something. And so in preparation for this, I kind of dug back into the vaults of the internet to try to find if I was correct or not. And there were some articles saying that there was like a big production problem because the original Scream 2 script did go online and they were trying to be so protective over it that there were certain rewrites that ended up happening. And
wow.
Yeah. So
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah. So that was kind of my memory of Scream 2. However, this is a great installment, I think, because obviously it keeps the mythology moving forward. The killer is Billy Loomis's mom, right? And then, which is crazy. I don't know how I felt about it in the time. I kind of like it now. I don't know. How do you feel?
I feel like it's just a fun play on Friday the 13th, where Mrs. Voorhees is the killer in the original.
I didn't even think about
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. But it takes place in college. It's just it's a fun slasher movie, and it's just continues its meta play. And I think it's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it basically just, like we've said for, other movies on our list, but I think it builds on all the things that the original did so perfectly. And it updates itself kind of from playing on horror tropes that the original did. And this just brings it into the arena of playing on horror sequel tropes. And like, I thought just the perfect example, the opening is so good and sets the stage so perfectly for what this movie is going to do, right? Because it opens on the big premiere of the Stab movie, which is the fictional slasher based on the events in the original Scream. And then, you see the first murder literally happens in the theater as they're watching a movie about what happened in Scream.
Yeah.
And then almost immediately following that, you're in a college film class where the students are debating the merits of various movie sequels. And so it's like, right away, this movie is going to be commenting on itself in the same way that the original did, but from the angle of horror sequels. And yeah, it just kind of reinvents itself from what the original was. And I love this movie also.
All right. We're almost there, right? We have, how many more do we have? We have 3 more?
I've got 2 more.
Okay. I've got 1 more.
Yeah.
And I'm switching up my 1 more, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So this is the second surprise for me in this podcast.
Yeah. But plot twist number 2, like a good horror film.
Yeah.
All right, go for it.
All right, my next one is Ouija: Origin of Evil, which came out in 2016, and this movie was directed by Mike Flanagan and written by Mike Flanagan and Jeff Howard. And yeah, if you know me, you know how big of a fanboy I am of Mike Flanagan. I essentially love everything that he does. But this movie, I think, is the prime example of what we talked about a little bit earlier, where a sequel just wildly improves on the original. because this, it takes a movie that is, in my opinion, not super great, and I don't think it did that well critically, and it just improves on it in just about every way. Which that scores a lot of points for me. This is actually a prequel to the original, I believe. I think this is a period piece, and it's just a really solid horror movie. It's about a mother and a widow who, she has sort of a phony seance business. She's kind of like a fake psychic, and they start playing with an Ouija board, and they invite this demonic spirit in that possesses one of her daughters. And in classic Mike Flanagan fashion, it gets very emotional. There's a lot of heart to the movie. It's also very dark, and the scares are spectacular. And yeah, it's just a really, really good horror movie coming on the heels of a not so great horror movie. So that, I think that makes it one of the best sequels in my mind.
I'm with you. If you throw a Ouija board in anything, I'm scared. I won't use one to this day. I've used one when I was younger, when you're at like kids parties. Yeah.
I never so when I was a kid, I saw Ed and Lorraine Warren speak, and they said, I think they said that like over half of their cases originated from people playing with an Ouija board. And after that, I was out on Ouija boards. If I was ever at a party where people were going to play with an Ouija board, I'd like, peace out. I'm out of here. I'm not even risking it. Whether you think it's real or not, I'm just not down to even risk the chance that shit is real.
Yeah. Screw that.
Yeah.
Okay, my last one, which I don't even know if you know is coming. Maybe I brought it up. Ready for this?
Hit me.
Scream 5, otherwise just titled Scream, which was
the reboot. The reboot sequel.
The reboot sequel. And I had a different one down here, and I probably should have. I don't want to just keep saying Scream and Wes Craven oriented films here, but I remember really liking it. And it's directed by the Radio Silence guys, and who did Ready or Not. And the weird thing about it is it tried to like humanize Billy Loomis, which was a little strange.
That was one of my only. I really enjoy this movie. Also, that was one of my only bumps.
Which is a big bump.
Yeah.
But I just really love this movie, and I felt like it was the proper updated version of what I wanted to see personally. Like I actually really enjoy the sequels to Scream. I think they're always fun to watch.
Definitely one of the strongest franchises as a whole, I think.
I think so too.
In the horror genre.
I think so too. But it just felt like this one really made Ghostface like a freaking badass again, and just ruthless. And it almost felt like, to me at least, kind of getting deeper into the sequels again, as much as I love the sequels, it was almost becoming a little sillier and a little bit more fun. And this one, I think this rebooted one, which was a continuation, it was scary again, and it was also darker, and it just made Ghostface a bit scarier than where he was going, or where she was going, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. And sort of similar to what we were saying about Scream 2, how that, works on all the tropes of horror sequels. The Scream 5 kind of attacks it from the angle of the new sort of trend of rebooting all of the horror movies.
Yeah.
And so it's like the rules of a reboot, basically, which is really fun.
All right, take us home.
All right, my last one. I'm going Flanagan back to back. My last one is Doctor Sleep, which is the sequel to The Shining that came out in 2019. And it's based on Stephen King's novel, Doctor Sleep, which is his sequel to The Shining. And it essentially follows Danny Lloyd, the young son from the original Shining, as an adult, as he's dealing with his own demons and his alcoholism. And he winds up meeting a young girl who also shines, who also has this power, this psychic power of the Shining. And he helps her escape a group of essentially cannibalistic immortals who are after her powers, because that's how they remain immortal, is by killing children who shine and basically ingesting their psychic powers. I really loved this movie. I mean, I think the okay, so I'll just say the reason that this is one of the best sequels ever in my mind is because Mike Flanagan accomplished the impossible with this
Mm.
movie, I think, in that he made a movie that serves as a sequel to both Stephen King's novel and to Stanley Kubrick's movie, which are two very, very different things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've maybe talked about this on the podcast before, how I have a complicated relationship with Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. I really enjoy it and respect it as an incredible piece of filmmaking, and certainly one of the scariest horror movies ever.
Mm-hmm.
But it also rips the heart out of Stephen King's novel, which is my favorite book of all time.
Yeah.
And Mike Flanagan, I mean, everything that guy does is just all heart. And so he salvages the heart from the novel The Shining that Stanley Kubrick had kind of kicked to the side. But then you also have this amazing third act where they go back to the Overlook Hotel, and there's just all these visual callbacks to Stanley Kubrick's iconic film. So if you're a fan of Stanley Kubrick's movie, you are getting all of the nostalgia and all the callbacks from that movie. And if you are a fan of Stephen King's novel, you are getting all of the heart and the emotion from that novel that was missing from Stanley Kubrick's movie. So I have, it's mind-blowing to me that Mike Flanagan was able to marry those two things in such an effective way.
Sure.
And to me, that just is one of the greatest sequels ever. And it sadly kind of bombed at the box office, but seems to have found a real second life on streaming and VOD. There's a really good director's cut out there that you can watch, I think, on Max. And yeah, I'm really happy that it found its audience, because it deserves it.
I thought it also did the impossible and connect. It's obviously it's hard to make a sequel to The Shining, and
yeah,
he did
who would
it.
have thought that could be successful?
He freaking did it.
Yeah.
Okay, dude, we did it.
Did we do it?
Yeah, like Flanagan in The Shining, we did it.
We did it. We accomplished the impossible here today.
We did. Those are our best, favorite horror sequels. Again, we're not saying this is it. This is just what we preferred and what we like to watch and the reasons why we like it. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up.
Yeah, this has been a blast. Thank you for having me on.
Dude, thank you for co-hosting. Hopefully Tasha returns. I don't want to, push you away from the Act Two podcast, but
I think
we'll see her again.
It eventually needs to return to its rightful owners, and you guys just keep it going. I have a feeling I'll be back.
You absolutely will. All right, quote of the day.
There'll be another installment in this franchise.
You're going to like this quote of the day. The first monster you have to scare the audience with is yourself. Wes Craven. As always, the Act Two podcast is a production of the Act Two Network. You can find us at ActTwoWriters. You can find me, Joshua Hallman, on Twitter, Josh Hallman on Instagram. Dave?
D_Levinson7 on Instagram, and D_Lev24 on Twitter.
Once again, we're a production of the Act Two Network, and this was edited by Paul Lundquist.